Vincent Cara had spent 30 years building an empire on silence, obedience, and fear. Men trembled when he entered a room. Rivals disappeared when he gave the order. To the city, he was a legend, untouchable, cold, incapable of mercy. He owned half the docks and 3 restaurants, and he moved through the world like a shadow, expecting every person he encountered to understand one simple rule. They existed to serve his will. The diner on Marlow Street was one of his places, not officially, but everyone knew. It was where he took breakfast at 6 in the morning, where deals were whispered over cold coffee, where men learned their fate. The waitress, Sarah, had worked there for 4 years. She was in her late 40s, with kind eyes that had seen too much kindness wasted, and hands that trembled sometimes when Vincent Cara was in the booth. She had learned long ago that invisibility was survival. But that Tuesday morning, something broke in Vincent. Or perhaps something revealed itself that had been breaking all along. He ordered Sarah to clean his shoes, not politely, not as a request, an order, a deliberate act of humiliation, performed in front of his bodyguards and 2 rival captains. It was meant to be a message. This is what happens when you exist in my world. Everyone serves, everyone falls. What happened next wasn't rebellion. It wasn't anger or defiance. It was something far more dangerous, an act of quiet dignity that would unravel 30 years of armor, brick by brick. Chapter 1. The Kingdom of Fear. Vincent Cara sat in booth 7, like a general surveying conquered territory. The diner smelled like burnt coffee and the grease that never quite washed away from the corners, but he didn't notice. He never noticed things like that. His mind was elsewhere, on the shipment delayed at the dock, on the captain from the south side who was asking questions he shouldn't ask, on the erosion of loyalty that came with age. He was 63 years old, and power had become a habit. His hands were steady, his voice was measured. Men still feared him because they remembered what he was capable of, because they had seen the result of his displeasure, because they understood that Vincent Cara did not threaten. He acted, but fear was exhausting. He had begun to realize this only recently, in the small hours of the morning, when he sat alone in his office above the restaurant, staring at nothing, holding a glass of wine that never got any warmer. Fear didn't build loyalty anymore. It only built distance. It only built silence. Sarah approached his booth with the coffee pot. She moved carefully, the way she always did when he was there, like someone walking on ice, aware that a single wrong step would mean falling. Her uniform was pressed, her hair was tied back. She had perfected the art of being present and invisible simultaneously. "Coffee, Mr. Cara?" she asked, her voice steady but small, the way a person speaks in a church or a cemetery. He didn't answer immediately. He was looking at his shoes. Expensive Italian leather, polished that morning by a man he paid to keep them perfect. They were scuffed from yesterday, from the walk across the dock, from a puddle he hadn't bothered to avoid. And something in him, something ancient and poisoned, wanted to make someone pay for that small imperfection. "You see these shoes?" he said. Sarah looked down. Her hand holding the coffee pot wavered slightly. "Yes, sir. They're filthy. You're going to clean them, here, now, in front of these men, and you're going to do it on your knees." The diner went quiet. His bodyguards exchanged glances, the kind of look that wasn't quite understanding, but was entirely obedient. The 2 captains from the south side watched to see what would happen, to gauge whether this was protocol or cruelty. One of them smiled, the smile of a man who was learning that Vincent Cara's power had evolved beyond business into theater. Sarah set down the coffee pot. Her hands were shaking now. She pulled a cloth from her apron, a thin, faded thing that had cleaned 1,000 tables, and lowered herself to the floor in front of Vincent's booth. This was the moment. This was the moment that would define everything that came after. Chapter 2. The Weight of Kneeling. Sarah knelt on the linoleum floor, and time moved differently for her. The world became very small and very loud. She could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the back, the tick of the ancient clock above the counter, the sound of her own breathing. She could feel the eyes of 5 men on her, Vincent's bodyguards, the captains, and somewhere behind the counter, probably Tony, the owner, who had learned long ago never to interfere. The humiliation was complete. She understood that now, fully and without question. This wasn't about shoes. It was about dominion. It was about Vincent Kara reminding everyone in the diner, that in his world there were masters and servants, and the distance between them was absolute. She reached out to touch his shoe, and her hand was steady. That surprised her. She had expected to cry. She had expected to feel something break inside herself, some final wall of dignity collapse under the weight of this public cruelty. But instead, she felt something else, a kind of clarity, thin and cold, like morning light on ice. She began to wipe his shoe with the cloth. The leather was soft. She could feel the craftsmanship of it, the expense of it, the fact that this shoe had been made by someone's careful hands, the same way she made her sandwiches each morning, the same way she had once made her daughter's Halloween costume, stitch by stitch, with precision and a kind of love that asked for nothing in return. Vincent Kara watched her. He watched her hands move methodically across his shoe, watched her face remain composed, watched her focus on the task with an attention that seemed almost reverent. And something in his chest, something he had thought was permanently closed, began to open just slightly, just enough for a cold wind to blow through. Chapter 3. The Crack in the Armor. Sarah finished cleaning the first shoe and began on the second. Her knees ached against the hard floor. The cloth was becoming damp from her palms, which were sweating, though her face remained calm. Around her, the diner had become a cathedral of judgment and silence. Vincent realized as he watched her that he had made a mistake, not a tactical error, not a strategic miscalculation, a human mistake, the kind that revealed something true about the world, something he had spent 30 years trying to deny. That cruelty was easy, but it was also corrosive. It poisoned the poisoner. When Sarah finished, she rose to her feet with difficulty. Her knees were red from the floor. She held the cloth in her hands, and for a moment their eyes met. There was no anger in her gaze. There was no triumph, no passive resistance, no hidden rebellion. There was only a kind of compassionate recognition, as if she was seeing in that moment something about Vincent Kara that he had not meant to reveal. "Your shoes are clean now, sir," she said quietly. Vincent looked down at his feet. The shoes gleamed. They were flawless. "Comment where you're watching from," he heard himself say, though he hadn't planned the words. "I want to know how far stories like this one, stories of what happens when power meets dignity, can travel." It was an odd thing to say. His bodyguards didn't understand it. The captains from the south side exchanged confused glances. But Vincent had broken his own script, had stepped outside the narrative he had been writing for 30 years, and he couldn't quite find his way back. Chapter 4. The Reconstruction. Sarah returned to the kitchen, and Vincent sat alone with his coffee, which had grown cold. He thought about the morning, about how he had woken in his apartment, how he had looked at his reflection in the mirror and barely recognized the face looking back. He thought about his wife, who had died 7 years ago, who had tried near the end to talk to him about mercy. He had dismissed her. Mercy was weakness. Mercy was a luxury for people without power. But watching Sarah clean his shoes, he had seen something. His wife's hands, not literally, but the same quality of care, the same precise attention to a small, insignificant task, as if it mattered, as if the person performing it mattered. He had built his empire on the assumption that people were interchangeable, that Sarah was replaceable, that loyalty could be purchased, that fear was the most efficient form of control. But what if he had been wrong? What if the very foundations he had built upon were built on sand? He asked for Sarah again. She came to his table with caution, ready for a reprimand or another test. "Sit," he said. She hesitated. "I'm not going to hurt you. Sit." She sat across from him in the booth, and he saw fear in her eyes, not the fear he was accustomed to seeing, but something deeper, the fear of someone who's about to be broken in a new way. "How long have you worked here?" he asked. 4 years, she said quietly. "Why?" "I need the work. I have a daughter. She's in university. I work here and at another place on weekends." Vincent nodded slowly. He realized he had never asked her anything personal before. He had never seen her as anything other than a service provider, a function, not a person. "What's her name?" he asked. "Marie." "What's she studying?" "Medicine." "She wants to be a doctor." Vincent looked down at his hands. They were the hands of a man who had spent 30 years breaking things. He wondered what it would take to build something instead. Chapter 5. The Erosion of Empire. Over the next few weeks, Vincent began to appear at the diner at different times, not always at 6 in the morning, sometimes at 3 in the afternoon, when the diner was nearly empty, when it was just Sarah and the lunch crowd thinning out. He would sit in booth 7, and they would talk. She told him about Marie, about how her husband had left years ago, about how she had worked 3 jobs at one point, about how she had learned to find small joys in small things, a customer's smile, a recipe that turned out right, the sound of her daughter laughing on the phone. He told her nothing, or rather he tried not to. But gradually he found words coming out that surprised him, words he had never spoken to anyone, about his wife, about the loneliness of power, about the realization that he had spent decades building a kingdom that was essentially a tomb. His men noticed the change. They saw him spending more time at the diner, less time at the office. They saw him hesitate in decisions that had once come naturally. They saw the cracks forming in the authority structure that had held everything together through fear and force. The captains from the south side, sensing weakness, began to make their moves. There were whispers about succession, about whether Vincent's time was ending. His own bodyguards began to drift toward other alliances. Power, he was learning, was not held. It was constantly performed, constantly reinforced, constantly lost. One night his closest lieutenant, Frank, a man who had been with him for 20 years, confronted him in his office above the restaurant. "You're losing them," Frank said. "The men, they're losing respect. They're saying you've gone soft, that you care more about a waitress than about business." "What if I do?" Vincent asked. Frank stared at him as if he had spoken in a language that no longer existed. "Then you're finished," Frank said, "and everyone knows it." Chapter 6. The Descent and the Choice. The next morning, Vincent found Sarah being harassed by one of the younger crew members, a kid, maybe 25, who thought the rules had changed, who thought that because Vincent's attention had shifted, the old protocols no longer applied. The kid was crude and aggressive, and Sarah was backed against the counter with nowhere to go. Vincent moved without thinking. He crossed the diner in 3 strides and broke the kid's arm. It was an old habit, an old violence, executed with the kind of efficiency that reminded everyone in the diner that Vincent Kara was not soft. He had simply chosen where to direct his power. "If anyone touches her again," Vincent said quietly, "I will end them. I don't care who they are. I don't care what they mean to me. You understand?" The message was clear. Sarah had become important enough to kill for. In the world Vincent inhabited, that was a kind of declaration that couldn't be taken back. It was a statement of vulnerability, and vulnerability in his world was a death sentence. "If this story already has your heart," he said to the gathered men, repeating words that had begun to feel like a refrain, "hit the like button. It helps the story of Sarah reach more people who still believe that even in darkness, compassion can grow." He was speaking to them as if they were part of something larger than themselves, as if there was an audience beyond the diner, beyond the criminal world, people who might understand what was happening, who might recognize it as something other than weakness. Chapter 7. The Revelation. That evening, alone in his office, Vincent pulled out an old photograph. It was his wife, taken about 10 years before she died. She was in a hospital, a volunteer, helping a young woman hold her newborn child. The love in his wife's face was absolute and unguarded. He had seen that photograph 1,000 times and had never understood it until now. He realized, looking at Sarah, at the way she moved through the world with care and attention, that his wife and Sarah were the same person, really. Or rather, they were both examples of the same rare quality, the ability to see the dignity in another person and to treat it as sacred. His wife had tried to teach him this. She had spent years trying to make him understand that power without compassion was just cruelty with better resources. He had dismissed her. He had told her it was naive, that the world didn't work that way, that mercy was a luxury. But she had been right. And it had taken him 30 years and the simple act of watching a woman clean his shoes to understand it. He called Frank to his office. "I'm stepping down," Vincent said. Frank couldn't hide his shock. "There's going to be a transition. You'll take the helm gradually. The money will be distributed, the operations will continue, but the violence, the unnecessary violence, it ends. Anyone who can't accept that is out." "You're serious," Frank said. "I've never been more serious." Chapter 8. The Weight of Redemption. The transition took months. There were negotiations, confrontations, a few departures, but Vincent's authority, even diminished, was enough to hold things together long enough for the new structure to take hold. He kept the diner, kept Booth 7, kept the routine that had become something like peace. Sarah knew what he had done. She knew that his stepping down had cost him, that there were men who saw it as betrayal, that his power was gone, that he had made himself vulnerable in a way that was almost incomprehensible to the people around him. "Why did you do it?" she asked him one morning as she poured his coffee. "Because I realized," Vincent said, "that I had been living in darkness so long I had forgotten what light looked like, and then I saw it, for the first time in decades, reflected in your face when I humiliated you. You didn't break. You didn't become bitter. You stayed whole. I wanted to know how you did that. I wanted to understand mercy." Sarah sat down across from him, and for the first time, he saw her not as a waitress, not as a person he had once tried to dominate, but as an equal, a teacher, a guide, a reminder of what it meant to be human. "Compassion isn't weak," she said. "It's the strongest thing there is. It's what holds the world together. I learned that from my mother, and I tried to teach it to Marie, and now I'm teaching it to you. Better late than never, I suppose." Vincent reached across the table and took her hand. It was a simple gesture, but it contained everything he had been unable to express for 30 years. Gratitude, apology, the beginning of something that might, eventually, be called healing. Chapter 9. The Epilogue. 2 years later, Vincent Cara is 65 years old, and he walks through the city differently now. He walks with lighter steps. His face has softened. The lines around his eyes are different, not the lines of cruelty or exhaustion, but the lines of someone who has learned to smile. He has given away most of his money. The diner is Sarah's now, officially owned by her, the deed in her name. Marie graduated and got into a good medical school. Vincent paid for it, though it took months of arguments with Sarah before she would accept the money. In the end, she relented because she understood that he needed to give, that the ability to offer help without expecting dominion in return was part of his redemption. The restaurant above the diner, the one where power used to be bought and sold, is now a community center. It offers free meals to anyone who asks, job training, counseling services. It's not atonement. Vincent understands that now. There is no atonement sufficient for 30 years of harm, but there is restitution. There is the daily choice to build instead of destroy. Every morning, Vincent still sits in booth 7. Sarah brings him coffee without being asked, and they talk about the small things, the weather, Marie's studies, the latest customer with a strange story. And sometimes on quiet mornings, when the diner is nearly empty, they sit in silence together, and that silence is more complete and more peaceful than any Vincent experienced in 30 years of power. On the wall beside booth 7, someone, maybe Sarah, maybe Tony the owner, has hung a photograph of rain on a city street at dawn. The neon lights beginning to fade as the sun rises. It's the kind of image that doesn't seem to belong in a simple diner. But it belongs here because it speaks to what happened in this place. The moment when darkness began to break, when a man learned that power could be released, that mercy was possible. That redemption was not a reward, but a practice, a daily choice to see the dignity in another person and to protect it as if it were sacred. Subscribe for more stories of loyalty, forgiveness, and redemption. Vincent finds himself saying sometimes to the regulars, to the new faces, to anyone who will listen. Thank you for witnessing the transformation of Vincent Cara. See you in the next one. And as he says it, he believes it. There will be a next one. There will always be a next moment to choose compassion, a next opportunity to build instead of destroy, a next chance to remember that even in the margins of morality, even in the shadow of empire, human hearts continue to beat, to break, to heal.